I am located near Table Rock Lake in Arkansas. I am an avid hunter and I am the one they use to call if an animal had been injured by a vehicle and it's not dead. I will come out and end the animal's misery and they tag it for me right there and I take it home and butcher it. Sometimes I keep the meat and sometimes I use it for dog food or give it away to others for their dogs. Maybe they do things different now, I don't know. I retired from that when I stopped raising dogs, which was some 15 years ago. This would have been the fall of 96 or 97. It was middle of September on a misty or light rain Sunday late afternoon because I was kicked back watching a football game, the late afternoon game, so it was San Diego playing some no-name team and beating them badly enough I had mostly fallen asleep. Now I remember it was Cleveland. So the phone rings and it's the county wanting me to go pick up of all things a big bull elk. This would have been a year or so before they even allowed any sort of elk hunting at all because they had just reintroduced them back into the area maybe 10 years prior. So they had increased their numbers to the point the government was going to allow limited hunting for them very soon, but they were definitely still rare for the area and I didn't know what a head and rack of a big bull elk from this area was going to bring, but I knew it was worth driving out to get the thing. Its back end was pretty torn up and it had died by the time I got there, which made things easier on me since after looking at how tore up the back half of the big boy was, it was clear I wasn't going to want the meat even if it had still been alive. The head and rack were another story. Usually by the time I am notified and then arrive at the scene of the accident, if there was a car or truck damage to the point of needing towed, it has already been done. In fact, usually there is just one cop waiting for me to arrive, and as soon as I get there they tag the body and I get started figuring out how to load it onto my vehicle. I ask for none and am offered no help. I have or did have back then a pickup truck with a homemade back window protection, or some call it a headache rack. It's basically a board, or in my case a board with a small window cut into it that protects the window in the back of the truck cab. With the small window cut into it I can still see using my rear view mirror, or because I have a back window which slides open, if someone was in the back of the truck you could hand something through the back window as long as it fit through the small window cut out of the headache rack. Well, by the time I got there it was full on dark, the rain hadn't let up but wasn't coming down in buckets either. It was just a steady heavy mist coming down. That kind of mist dulls down everything vision-wise. It makes lights visible from less distances, and when it is dark it can blur the lines of what you are looking at. Especially when you are looking into the lights of another car. Well, when I arrived at the scene the big boy was laying off on the side of the road, so I swung around and backed up to where it was at, positioned so that the cop's car was behind me and its headlights were on the back of my truck and the dead elk laying between our vehicles. It was a young guy, couldn't have had more than a year or two under his belt, and I suspect that is why he got assigned to the Dead Animal Patrol. He had on the state issue raincoat, or parka I believe might be the proper term, and I assume it's state issued, anyway. So he comes walking up to me as I by then already have my board I used to slide the animals up to get them on my truck, and I have a come along that I used to get really big bodies up onto the back of the truck. So I quickly hooked the cable of the come along to the back legs of the elk and jumped up into the back of my pickup and began pulling the big animal's body up the loading pert and into the back of my truck. Well, I got the thing wenched all the way up into the bed and jumped down, and the cop needed some information which they already have, but anyway, so I invited him to sit in the cab of my truck while I answered his questions. The rain was picking up a bit and so he accepted my offer, I think more to protect the paper he was trying to write on than anything to do with getting out of the mist. In any case, he climbed into the driver's seat as I slid over to the passenger side. It was one of those old Fords that have that straight seat all the way across the cab. The truck was a late 70s model 150. Anyway, so the cop slides into the driver's seat and the keys are sitting in the ashtray, because that's my habit when I get out of the truck and nobody is around. Instead of pocketing the keys I just toss them into the ashtray. I figure if somebody ever did try to jump in the truck and steal it, that the few seconds it would take them to locate it and use the keys would be long enough for me to get there. Plus, and mostly as it's an old truck, who would want to steal it? So we're sitting there and the rain has picked up to almost more than a drizzle, and I'm answering my exact address numbers to the cop and he's writing this down, and we feel the truck drop down like something heavy had just been dropped down into the back. I mean, it was a very noticeable difference in weight on the back of the truck. Now keep in mind that the cop's car is positioned behind us so that we can have a clear view of anything between that car and where we were, that was in the back of my truck. However, we must view through the small window cut out of my headache rack. I suspect it was lucky for us that the cops' headlights were at the angle they were, because though I will never know for sure, but I am betting those headlights were catching the back window of my truck just so that the creature could not see inside the cab, causing the glass to have that mirror effect. But I think it knew we were there. Keep in mind that I had my deer rifle with me, but I hadn't taken it down off the gun rack because the elk was already dead. So the gun wasn't loaded and was sure to make some bit of noise if I tried to move it from where it rested. Plus it would make it much easier for the creature to see into the cab if I took the rifle down from the rack, since where it sat was in the way of the little window I had cut out of the headache rack. The kid cop that was in the cab with me drew his gun and I put my hand on his and shook my head. I was thinking, you will only piss it off if you shoot it with that thing. He kept it drawn but made clear he wouldn't use it unless he was forced. So there we were sitting in the back of my old Ford pickup with something that weighed a hell of a lot, which of what we could see through the small window cutout was something with legs that resembled dark hairy tree trunks that grabbed the elk and picked it up off the bed of the truck like it was nothing and started walking down the loading board that was still at the back of my truck. It got as far as that I could see the backside of its muscular thighs and butt, and then the come along began to reach the end of the part of it that is easy to pull out of the thing. What had happened was when I got the elk far enough up into the back of the pickup, I then hit the release on the come along and the elk's body dropped down into the bed, and I never bothered to actually unhook the come along cable from the elk's legs. When the cable started to resist, the creature turned and yanked on the elk and the whole truck shook, but everything held. The creature started growling and pulled on the elk again and again, the whole truck shook but everything held. Well, I will tell you, these things are not stupid, but they do seem to be ill-tempered, because after the second try it threw the elk down and stepped over its body, which was laying on the loading board but by now was completely out of the truck, and the come along had reached the end of the cable, and the creature, which I still hadn't seen its face well, I saw its hand follow the cable back to where I had the come along anchored to the headache rack via a simple rope I had run through the cutout window. I mean, I wasn't expecting to even need that much in terms of resistance to pulling a dead elk body up a short ramp into the back of a pickup. So when its hand got to the come along, it grabbed the come along and gave it a yank, and the headache board gave where I had the window cut out, due to the fact the weakest link involved was the 2x2 piece of wood that was where the little window was cut out of the headache rack. Imagine you have a 2x12 by the length of the back of the cab on your pickup. You place that board over the area where your back window is, and before you do so, you cut out a rectangle-shaped piece of wood which is directly in line with your rear view mirror, so that you can see out that back window enough to drive and see what is behind you, but not so large a window that something could easily fit into the cutout and therefore break the glass in the back window. So the creature had to break a board which was roughly 2x2 by about 10 inches, which would take incredible strength. The wood gave, and when it did, we both jumped back as far as we could into the shadows of the truck cab, trying not to be seen by the head of whatever was attached to this extremely muscular and tall body. There was a terrible sour odor which I attributed to being more a smell brought from having walked through some really bad swampy area than thinking it was the creature itself. The musky scent was probably the creature, but nothing living that I can imagine would naturally smell so sour. In any case, the air was a mixture of that musky and that sour odor. Again, I was reaching across the truck along the top of the seat trying to calm the kid and keep him from shooting that gun, because I didn't see any way this would end well if he started shooting. I would never be able to get my rifle down and loaded before that thing had tore us both to pieces, and as mentioned, I don't think that 9mm Glock was gonna be enough to stop this thing before it took the pistol away and stuck it up somebody's backside. When I was able to see the thing in its hole, it was incredible. You hear people describe things, and any time the description takes off in a direction beyond what the mind is accustomed to imagining, and you really lose the impact that it has on you when you are facing it for real. Let me tell you that when I say 7.5, maybe 8 feet in height, you probably lose the true impact that it has when you are looking at it for real. The muscles on the thing are in line with its huge height, so it is in fact a giant in more than just stature. When I saw the legs on this thing through that little window, I felt terribly worried that when it figured out the elk was caught on something in the truck, that it would actually be able to pull the truck over on its side if the creature had exited the bed by jumping off the side instead of walking back out the end of the truck. That is how powerful this creature looked to me. Like if he was pissed off that he could roll or pull the truck over sideways. It stopped growling when it had freed the come along from its perch where I had strapped it to the headache board. It was the last time I ever saw that come along, or that elk, or that creature again. I don't think either of us ever got a really good look at its face, but we both watched it as it walked into the dark with the elk thrown over its shoulders and the come along dragging by its cable along behind them like some Twilight Zone version of a just married scene. We sat there in silence looking out into the night for maybe 3 or 4 minutes after the creature had disappeared into the darkness. The rain had turned to sleet and now there was a persistent light tapping on the top of the old Ford. That kind of brought us out of the trance, or perhaps better said shock, that we were in. The kid wasn't sure what to do. At first he started to get out of the truck and hurry back to his car to call in for help, and then he stopped and came back into my cab and shut the door and looked at me and said, "We can't tell anybody about this, can we?" And I looked him back in the eye and said, "Well, it would be your word and the Roadkill guy's word that in the middle of a dark rainstorm, the Tooth Fairy came along and took an elk away from 2 grown men. No offense, but I'm in no hurry to have the world judge us and the extent of the truth of what we say as being the kid cop and the Roadkill guy with this grand story of a giant hairy creature stealing an elk out of an old truck and then throwing the 600-plus-pound carcass over one shoulder and disappearing into the thick woods." So he asks me, what should I report? I told him to report what he knew that mattered. The elk was removed from the road. It had been tagged for legal transportation, and what the folks did with it when they got it home was their business. Case closed. Then I said, "Trust me, kid, if you want to continue being a cop that's taken seriously, let this one go." So far I have never run onto that kid again. He was smart enough not to get us killed by going postal on that creature. I bet it cost me between $2 and $5 grand to lose the head of that elk, and I bet that part wasn't even eaten by the creature. Now that I am safe and here talking about it, I wish I would have seen the creature's face. But if you asked me if I wanted to see its face that night, I would have said not in a million years, or until it was behind some very strong metal bars.